Hey everybody, this is Perch. I hope you're doing well, and I'm not. I'm still got this cold, so my voice is like this. It's I don't know, maybe it doesn't sounds a lot different to me. Always fun to do videos when you're stuffed up. But I had did a video a few days ago talking about how there was a correction coming to the industry, or reckoning coming to the industry, and that's not meant to sound dramatic, but it is a change that's happening in the very near future. And I think as we get into kind of right about, I mean, one would argue we're already in it. That the actions that took place with DC, and I think as we look back at this, maybe 5 years in the future, as we look back on this period of time, I think we're going to look at what happened with Diamond and some of the distribution and some of the price changes and the creative shuffles and everything else is all part of this shift. I do feel very optimistic about where comic books in general get to in about 2 to 3 years. I think it'll be a healthier place, but I think it'll be much different. It's easy for people to say, oh, it'll be much better, it'll be much healthier, if some of the stuff you currently enjoy doesn't survive that transition, and some of it won't. But I wanted to give a little bit more specifics about what do I mean by reckonings. It sounds very dramatic. It sounds overly dramatic, and that's not really what I'm after here. There's a lot of history and data that shows that these changes happen, that corrections do take place in the industry. The ones that a lot of people remember is what happened in the late 90s or the late 70s, where you had the DC implosion, or you had the bottom fall out of the speculator market and comics, and I think what we're going through now is going to resemble those two events, probably fairly closely. I would argue actually that we were due for it about 3-4 years ago, and the success of the MCU combined with the resurgence of manga, I'll explain both in a second, I think that prolonged things a little bit. The MCU brought a lot of attention to comics that created new opportunities to get money from graphic novels that have been in print for a long time. It added some credibility to comics in general, and it allowed a lot of the big companies, primarily Disney, Marvel, and Warner and DC, now AT&T DC, to basically say things like, you wouldn't downsize comics, you wouldn't change comics. I mean, it's $1 billion movie. Why you wouldn't do that now? And so I think at the corporate level, it prolonged some much needed changes. You had a bunch of people kind of keep their jobs who arguably 20 years ago during the 90s, or 20 years before that in the 70s, would have been kind of shuffled out. But it gave it a little bit more life. And I think the other thing that happened, and it was why you saw so many articles hammering this point, is you had YA and manga enter the game. And both of those were quickly folded into comics. It's like, oh, the comics industry is booming. Well, because they added these two new segments to the market, to how we were counting the math. And it kind of hid the fact a little bit that the numbers were stagnant or falling. I think stagnant is a more honest word. Lots of sites will talk about, the bottom is dropping out from other things, but there's so many little elements to it that's a fairly unfair comparison. But stagnant is not good news. And this is where I think if you understand kind of business and finance and all these kind of pieces, stagnant, if you're in a growth industry, is arguably worse than failing. With failing, people swoop in and they make aggressive corrections and they move people around for their jobs, and they shift, and it's a call to action to make change. Stagnant means that you're just stuck. It's a much harder problem to get out of. It tends to take longer for corrections to happen. Investors absolutely hate it. Stagnation is worse. It's why when you look at certain stocks and investing in companies, you will see that the investment community typically likes, of course, they like growth, but they also tend to know better what to do with failing companies than flat companies. Flat companies is the bane of their existence, and they tend to get hurt more over time. But as we look at what's going to happen, I think this is what just my advice for you to keep your eye on. The first is Diamond. Why? Well, Diamond remains this distribution hub of comics. It's what currently supplies the direct market in North America. Yes, I know, with the exception of what DC is doing. But by and large, it is Diamond that this industry kind of revolves around. And if you're a new company, if you're an emerging comic publisher, that typically is the route you're going to take to start to produce your comics. Well, actually, let me take a little detour here for a second. Um, there's a number of things I want you to look at. I mentioned Diamond. We'll come back to it in a second. But the one I want to insert here are the small publishers. Now, why is that? Well, because in a healthy growth industry, you see a lot of new small publishers entering the game, finding their footing, and starting to put product out on a regular basis. If you look at the growth industry of the 80s, if you look at the growth industry of the early 70s, if you look at the growth industry of the early 2000s, what you saw were a lot of small players coming out, not becoming the next Marvel or DC, but finding their footing and achieving stability. And that's really important. You have new people coming into comics. This is important for multiple levels. It gives new artists, new writers, new creatives an avenue to get going. It gives new properties, new ideas, something. And then nobody likes to talk about this part, but it also gives the big companies somewhere to steal from. Maybe that's ideas, maybe it's talent, maybe it's audience. You need that kind of feeder system in order for the whole world to be healthy. If you look at when comics have struggled, you notice a lot of the small guys, either dramatically cutting back on what they're doing, the rate of new publishers coming into the market shrinking, or companies, getting swallowed up, acquired, or removed. So one of the things to really keep your eye on over the next, say, 6 months are the small publishers. How many of them are going to survive? How many of them are going to decide to fold up shop? How many of them are going to dramatically cut back on their line? Take a look at Valiant. Valiant is definitely cutting back. You actually, if you do some basic kind of research over the last 2 years, notice that quite a few of the companies, with a few exceptions, Boom, Dynamite continues to chug along. Even IDW, with all their struggles, continues to chug along. Many of the smaller companies are producing less than they have before, and there's fewer new companies entering the market. Now, you can make the argument that, hey, some of these people are just going the crowdfunding route, or they're doing some these other things. Sure, there are individual efforts, but those individual efforts are not creating the feeder system we had in the past. That's why I've said I think we will get to a healthier place in comics, but there's going to be this drop. So keep your eye on the smaller comic publishers. In many cases, they are the bellwether for what's going to happen with the big guys. And then coming back to Diamond, the world revolves around Diamond in comics today, and Diamond is really struggling. Now, there's a number of very, I would say, unhealthy news articles and other things that get put out talking about Steve Jeppy and all his plans, and things are going great. But Diamond did close a warehouse a few weeks ago, and Diamond is, by all accounts, they need cash. We're seeing a lot of publishers starting to go direct to Random House and to others to get their books published. We're seeing more people than ever quietly leave Diamond. They're not doing it with the direct market. They're doing it for everything else. And that's a sign to keep your eye on. It means that these publishers are looking for a world to secure outside of Diamond, and in many cases outside of the direct market. But the challenge is, if you put too much of your focus on the local comic shop, on the direct market, it's not really terribly healthy. Retail in general is struggling. The direct market in general has had to pull back on a number of comics and what they sell, and make sure that they're diversifying their business. We've talked about that. So looking at the health of retail is not the best indication of anything right now. The world is changing for retail. So if you start to say, well, how many comic shops are starting or going or any of that, especially with this pandemic, it's not a good sign of the overall health of the industry. You may say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense because the direct market is what sells the comics. Yeah, absolutely. Except what we see from comic orders and numbers is, if a comic shop or two goes out of business and it shrinks, the larger comics shops, they basically get more business. It flows to them. You don't see customers who are going to a comic shop that closes do not suddenly stop buying comics. They just look for somewhere else to take their business. And so you see stuff shuffling around. Don't get me wrong. We need comic shops. We need this part of the business intact. But comic shops coming or going is not a huge indicator of where the business is at, as frankly we saw during other decades and other corrections in this market. The better one is Diamond. How financially stable is Diamond anyway? Diamond needs more money. Diamond is trying to change their business around. Many of the kind of the stable growth areas for them, basically shipping their comics to bookstores and being that facilitator to others, people are taking Diamond out of the equation. I think Diamond is in a lot of trouble, and I think that's probably, if we think about the kind of the tipping point that happens during these big corrections, it's Diamond that's going to be the one that is going to be our tipping point, because I think Diamond has a really bad summer, is my feeling. If you look at what Marvel and DC, DC doesn't apply here, but if you look at Marvel, Marvel is not putting out the Power event this summer so far. Maybe July changes everything up, but we're not seeing the big relaunches. We're not seeing brand new Spider-Man #1 or any of that kind of stuff that has boosted up the market over the last couple of years. We're seeing Heroes Reborn. We're seeing Hellfire Gala. We're seeing softballs from Marvel. I think we're headed for a weak summer, and that's going to hurt Diamond far more than it hurts the individual local comic shops. The ones that have survived are already diversifying their business. Diamond, on the other hand, especially if a lot of these publishers are starting to go direct to other places, they're going to get hurt bad by a weak summer. And I think we're headed for a weak summer. The other thing to kind of keep your eye on, I think, is look at companies and look at how much their talent is doing, particularly their writers. If you have a writer, is the writer writing one title or two titles or three titles or more? And what I'm seeing a lot of right now is a kind of very slow motion consolidation. You're seeing a lot of writers picking up more titles to do more, and they typically are people who are newer to the scene. There's been a lot of videos made by other people about people like Vita Ayala, but forget about the other parts of that. Just Vita Ayala is cheaper as a writer than, say, Bendis. So if you look at DC, for example, 2 years ago, Bendis was on multiple books. I think he was doing like 6 books at one point a month, maybe more. I don't know. But he was doing quite a few. Now you're seeing Vita Ayala do 6 books a month. Well, Vita's page rate is much cheaper than Bendis. So take a look at these companies and look at how they've got writers kind of spread, I would argue, thin, and then look at the writers that they are spreading thin. They're basically, they've lowered their rates. And in many cases, you're talking about companies that probably had some, well, not probably, for sure, had a couple contracts going out there that were ill-advised, where people were being paid more than, what they were worth. Well, more than the money they were bringing in, is a better way to put it. Those people are largely gone in the industry. They're doing much less. They just scaled back significantly from where they were at. So who's taking that place? Well, you're seeing kind of the companies fish around for a lot of just cheaper talent, and they're making those people do more. Now, making is a funny word because I'm sure these people are happy for the work, but it's another indication that the companies are preparing themselves for these big changes that are coming down the pipe. I want to stress again at the end here, I do believe that the industry gets to a better place. And I do believe it's going to be nice. I don't believe, though, that it's going to be nice for everybody. I think at this point, if you're predicting the future, manga is going to absolutely have a stronger, bigger place in comics. There's no doubt about it. It's not a fad at this point. It's stabilizing. And that is going to be something the industry is going to have to deal with. I think that if you look at the comic, the creators who had dreams of going to Netflix, I think that avenue is much smaller than it was before. Those deals are farther and fewer between. And so you're going to see the people who have made those deals do better. They're going to get their content out. We're going to see several years of comic book properties on Netflix and Prime and other places. We're going to see the people who've already secured those projects dig in, get some things done, probably make some good traction and make some good money, but you're going to see the door's not going to be open for tons of new people like frankly, I think it was an illusion. But 5, 6 years ago, there's this idea that everybody could get a Netflix deal, and that's clearly not going to happen. The ones who already have it are going to do well. The ones who were hoping they could get into it are going to find it's a very, very big struggle. And I think, Marvel's not going to go away. DC's not going to go away, but they're definitely going to change their lineup. And I actually believe very strongly that if we're looking at the comic industry 5, 6, 8 years from now, I think that you're going to see very strong growth from some of the indies. Boom does seem to have it down. Image, I think, Image is going to go through some major changes over the next couple of years to kind of differentiate between like the Skybound activities, the Spawn activities, the Millar World activities. I think that you're going to see some power players emerge there that will those brands will get stronger. But I think you're going to see the indies get bigger, and I think you're going to see largely Marvel and DC kind of, I don't want to say flatline. That sounds like death, but their world is not going to be the growth world. This next era belongs to others, and frankly, that's a good thing for everybody, including Marvel and DC, to have more strength there. But bluntly, a lot of people are not going to survive this transition. There's people who are kind of brought into this for cosmetic reasons or because they knew the right people on Twitter or so on. I mean, Twitter is being rapidly recognized as a dumpster fire by companies all over the place. And so this idea that, hey, I've got a lot of followers, I can get a lot of likes, or I can kind of get a lot of attention going on my tweets is going to mean far less when you're a publisher who, needs to make safe, smart bets with your capital. It doesn't matter. In fact, the mechanism around a lot of creators that kind of support each other by coming in and kind of complimenting, like, oh, you have the best book. No, you have the best book. That kind of stuff. It's that's going to be meaningless if you can't move numbers. It doesn't matter who your support group is. It doesn't matter how many likes or retweets you get. It's not going to matter. It's going to be an interesting time, but definitely a reckoning is coming. Definitely a correction is coming. I do think that we're looking at a comic industry that will look fairly dramatically different in the next 3 to 4 years. And honestly, I think by and large it will be a good one. But there's definitely going to be some salty people out there who won't survive it. But anyway, I just want to go into a little bit more depth, explain that. Those comments got a lot of emails from people within the industry. I don't think any single video has gotten more mails from people who are currently within comics. Everybody picked up on that one. So that's me explaining my thoughts a little bit more. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. I'm hoping some nice, smart people can be part of this transition and change, because comics needs to be innovative. A lot of other fields are. I think it's worth investing in. It's worth putting real thought, real time, real attention into it. And it needs people who are willing to do it. People who are wanting to build, not get clout. That's what comics should be. Anyway, let me know your questions in the comments below. Like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening.